Welcome, everyone. We're glad to have you with us. I want to remind you again, this reminds you a lot, and you'll keep hearing it for the next several weeks, about our question and response episode. If you got questions on the book of Philippians, send those over to our podcast. Email 15bigideapodcast@gmail.com. That's 15bigideapodcast@gmail.com. You can see that down in the show notes. Send us a message on Facebook or on Instagram. It's one of my favorite parts about sitting down and doing this podcast is where it's not just me talking into the silent vacuum of my office by myself, but I get to sit down and engage with the questions you guys have on the book and with a brother or sister, and really enjoy that opportunity. So I'm looking forward to doing that, and I hope that you'll send a question on over if you've got one. So with that, let's look at Philippians 4, verses 2 and 3. Philippians 4, verses 2 and 3. I urge Euodia and I urge Syntyche to live in harmony in the Lord. Indeed, true companion, I ask you also, urge these women who have shared my struggle in the cause of the gospel, together with Clement, as well as the rest of my fellow workers whose names are in the book of life. This week's episode is really going to kind of start to turn the corner. We're decidedly into the chapter 4 content. Kind of verse number 1, we mentioned maybe goes back with verse number 3, although there's a case for it being in chapter 4 as well. And we're really into the penultimate subsection. I mean, there's just kind of one more out of this. Out of this section on false teachers who make a show in the flesh, probably tying into efforts by Jewish Christians to force non-Jewish Christians to adopt Torah observance mixed with Philippian exceptionalism, Paul doesn't want to buy that for a moment, especially because this voice likely fuses exactly the sorts of things we mentioned, of an exceptionalism to create a facade of perfectionism. As such, there is no motivation for growth because you're perfect. Instead, Paul continues to press on as a fundamental attribute of what it means to be a mature Christian, of you keep pressing on, and he encourages the Philippians to do so as well because of their faith in the resurrection. The resurrection shapes our minds because we recognize that we will be transformed. And that has two implications. First, it means that we have not obtained perfection currently. It's something we wait for. Second, it means that whatever we can do that is necessary to lay hold on the resurrection is something we should do. We should be all about that. Now, Paul's going to transition from just a sort of the cultural context of Philippians into a bit of a dicey context in the church itself. And he's going to lay the groundwork for a critical teaching on Christian thought life that we'll explore in our next several episodes. Today's big idea is that unity is crucial. To understand how this text and what it has to say about the fact that unity is crucial, we want to look at number 1, have harmony in the Lord. Number 2, cooperation takes others. And number 3, evangelism is a team sport. So have harmony in the Lord, cooperation takes others, and evangelism is a team sport. Harmony, cooperation, team. This text begins with 2 names who are called out pretty strongly. Paul says he urges Euodia, and he urges Syntyche. I hope you'll forgive my pronunciation. I'm sure I'm not saying them right. But he wants them to live in harmony in the Lord. And he puts them on quite a blast, I'll say. I mean, it's not like I even like being called out in church for wearing a particular color shirt, and these ladies, they're called out for their failure to get along. There's some indication perhaps that this may be part of the reason for the letter, that they may be part of the ones who have allowed this exceptionalism to pierce into them. That's obviously surmising, but we don't know that's how that is for sure. We know these ladies had good cooperation in the work of the Lord. You can read that from verse number 3. However, something went wrong along the way, and they got their wires crossed. Apparently, this former friendship has turned into disagreement in some way. We can speculate about what that means, about how that happened, but the emphasis in this passage is on the work of the Lord. Paul calls on a true yoke fellow, all right, a yoke fellow, that is a co-laborer. He talks about the fact that these women and Paul used to share in a struggle of the gospel. He later talks about other fellow workers along with Clement as well. And it seems that Paul's concern here, his emphasis is about the work of the Lord, about the work of the gospel being advanced, as he's mentioned throughout the book. Sometimes we talk about Christian unity and fellowship as though it's just social agreeability and camaraderie and enjoyment of each other's company. And that's not it. From start to finish, Paul's concern has been about what advances the gospel, what moves it forward. It seems likely that this is about their ability to cooperate in a unified purpose for furthering the word of Christ. That's what's in view. That's what Paul wants to get fixed. As such, Paul calls for them to live in harmony in the Lord. Now, I want to notice that, in the Lord. Paul's not interested in some sort of temporary truce or a fabricated armistice or a let's just kind of avoid each other at church kind of thing. He doesn't want them to have some sort of ungodly solution either, to where if one of them is wrong or both of them are wrong, that they just cede to some ungodly idea. That's not what he wants either. Rather, they should both submit themselves to the will of God. Notice in calling both of these ladies out, he urges first Euodia and then he urges Syntyche as well, not just one lump. He's urging them each individually. We can observe there's probably faults on both sides. And usually when there's a personal disagreement, there's a little bit of fault on both sides. Sometimes we try to start analyzing who's right and who's wrong. In many ways, there's needful growth on both sides. When we're in the middle of a disagreement, we begin to justify ourselves when really perhaps we should look first in the mirror. If both parties do that, then usually you can reach an agreement. Whereas both live to justify themselves, it usually goes south sooner rather than later. These two need to reflect on what we've seen throughout the book about living as citizens of heaven and worthy of the gospel, and they need to have unity through that in the Lord. All right, Paul then does something kind of interesting as we get into the next passage. Instead of just leaving them alone and letting these two have it out and fix it themselves, he uses this phrase, true companion. And there's a lot of speculation about who this is. A lot of time gets spent on this. And the only commentators who get this right are the ones who say we have no idea. Now, there's a few reasonable assumptions. If you want us to talk about that, send a question to the question and response episode. We'll be glad to talk about it. But we really don't know. Here's what we do know is it had to be someone that everybody knew. So that when Paul puts them on notice, it's not like you read the letter at church and it's like you're looking around the room like, well, who's he talking about? There was somebody who everybody knew who he was talking to, and they knew that this guy or person potentially was going to take care of the situation. In this case, we want to notice something else. We want to notice that sometimes people need help living in harmony. People need help living in harmony, and there should be a willingness and desire to facilitate that. Sometimes we need an outside voice to mediate, to teach, to encourage, and even to admonish us in our pursuit of unity. Sometimes we need someone to be the grease between people. Sometimes we need to be the grease between people. We get kind of messy, but we reduce the friction and the heat in a way that allows others to work together. This can put us in a compromised spot. Sometimes stepping between people and making peace between warring factions means we get caught in the crossfire. But that's the work of helping people be unified, and it truly is gospel work as we are reconciled with Christ. Moreover, we need to notice who Paul calls on for this. Paul doesn't say, now church, go fix it. He calls on a single person who's respected for their spiritual insight and their experience. He doesn't just say, this is a democracy, everybody figured out. He calls on one person, we might say a limited number of people. In helping them to agree in the gospel work, notice Paul calls on someone who he's labored with, who knows what you got to do to make this work. He doesn't call on someone who's never had a difficult time or a struggle before. He's calling on someone who shared that burden, who understands and has the experience and the expertise to handle it. Moreover, if we call on help or mediation, we need to make sure they have experience. We need to make sure we're not just calling on someone who we like, or worse, someone who we just want to be on our side. Finally, Paul reflects almost surely with joy upon the former work that Euodia and Syntyche, along with this true companion Clement and others, have had in their work in the Lord. This supporting idea is that evangelism, the spreading of the gospel, is a team sport. It takes a squad of people working together to be most effective. It's not an individual activity where we kind of like come to church together, but we just kind of run in different directions. Now, does that mean we have to be on top of each other and all that sort of thing? Not necessarily. But for maximum effectiveness, we need to be working together rather than against each other. And even if we're in separate spheres, we should be going towards the same goals. And while Euodia and Syntyche are called out, one thing I do want to ignore here is that these are sisters. Okay, help these women who labored with us in the Lord, and they'd previously contributed to the work of the Lord. And Paul seems to be celebrating that fact that they did that. He doesn't say get Euodia and Syntyche to agree by stopping working because women should be a part of the work anyway. Certainly not at all. The work of advancing the gospel is the work of the citizens of the kingdom of Christ. We are all a part of this. We should notice that anyone that will conduct themselves in a manner worthy of the gospel has a place in the work of the Lord. As Paul says, this is a struggle, and more people we have, the more we have to bear that burden together, the more effective we can be. And that's why it's such a big deal for us personally as we step back to be a peacemaker, especially between people who have a desire to advance the gospel. The peacemaking itself is an example of what Christ has done. However, there's a very simplistic reality, is that if we agree and we can work together, we literally have more manpower. Trying to get people on the same page and agreement working together, especially through disagreement, is a worthy cause. It can seem sometimes, though, like it isn't, and that it's a waste of time. The walls of frustration, which may have been building for years, we may think will never come down, and it may require patience and persistence, but working around it is harder. It's really hard. Sometimes the only option in the interim is to just kind of skirt around it and do the best we can with the present frustration, but it takes a lot of work to do that. And many times, solving those issues between brothers and sisters and living in true fellowship will pay dividends in our ability to do the work of God. We should trust the wisdom of God, that true fellowship is better than a surface level pretending like things are okay when they really aren't. So this brings us to this end of this text on Christian unity and what's truly important. While personal growth and pursuit of Christ are critical, we can't remove that from our relationships with fellow members in the body. Being a Christian is quite simply not an individual activity. If you're doing it by yourself, you're doing it wrong. If it were, Paul might have been content to let these two carry on in disharmony. What would be the big deal? Or he may have told them, hey, it's fine. Christianity is just between you and Jesus. Just avoid each other. Rather, Paul calls them to the standard of Christ and calls other trusted people who know what it's like to advance the mission of Christ. And he asks them to help them get through this. Remember, Paul's emphasis on Christian unity here and agreement isn't just about niceties for the sake of social pleasantness. He wants a deep-rooted trust that propels the gospel forward so that they can live in harmony in the Lord. This harmony seeks to advance the mission of Christ. It moves themselves and others closer to Jesus. In some ways, living together is one of the ways we most difficultly and most really pursue the upward call of God in Christ Jesus, by moving those behaviors out of the way which prevent that. The behaviors in chapter 2 that Christ so passionately demonstrated and lovingly calls us to. So let's ask some questions. These are some hard ones. These are some hard ones that I have to ask myself. Are you living in unity with others? If one of your leaders in your congregation said, who are the ones who are peaceable and unifying and harmonious, are you on that list or are you on the troublemaker list? Are there any Christians at your church that you're just not on good terms with? Is there anyone that you avoid speaking to because you just can't stand them? How can you move towards them in faith and trust that the gospel can heal and unite? How can you endeavor together in a common task that advances the gospel? Could you potentially share in what you most have in common? Could the very thing that allows you to put aside your differences be working together in the thing you have in common? Are you the sort of person who makes it easy for others to get along? Or do you exacerbate strife and frustration amongst others? Are you the sort of person who can mediate and bring together frustrated parties? Or are you the sort of person that would just make it worse and drive people apart? If you had a dispute, would people come to you? Do you have the disposition but also the wisdom to be able to handle something like that? If you had a dispute, who would you go to, even if you could handle it? Even if you were someone who was called on, if you had a dispute and you needed someone to help, who would you go to? And how can you learn from them so that you are equipped to live in peace and harmony and to help others do so as well? Thank you so much for joining us today here at 15 Minutes in a Big Idea. Today's big idea: unity is crucial.